The Chemex was invented by a chemist in 1941. It ended up in the Museum of Modern Art as a best designed product for the time, but it still holds up today as a wonderful way to brew a pour over coffee. But there are a few tips and tricks to get the most out of this vessel. Let's get into it. Now, this is made from borosilicate glass, which is supposed to not really impart any flavors and creating a really smooth, bright cup of coffee. And that's what I really like about the Chemex, is that smooth, bright taste that it gives you. How much coffee can it make? Well, these things are sold in different sizes. This is the 6-cup variety. Now, in Chemex terms, a cup is 5 ounces of coffee, which is actually pretty small. That said, most of the time I just brew a single serving of coffee in this for myself. Now, there's no actual volume markings on here, so how do you know how much coffee you're brewing? Well, the top of the collar here, so just up to here, that is the full amount of coffee. So if you're all the way up to here with this particular vessel, you got your 6 cups. However, there's also this kind of indent here that sticks out on the front. I've seen people call this the belly button, which is very apt. The belly button shows you this is halfway. So if you fill the coffee up to this belly button here in this 6-cup vessel, well, you've brewed 3 cups or 15 ounces. But the Chemex is really only half the story. The other half is this, the Chemex Filters. These filters are quite different to other filters you might use with pour over coffee, and that's because they're a good deal thicker. So let's take a look at what these filters are. They are 20 to 30% thicker than most other filters, and they're just a folded piece of paper. So that's all it is, just a piece of paper folded in on itself. Now, how do you use this in the Chemex? There are essentially 4 layers here now on this corner. So we've got layer 1, 2, 3, and 4. We just take one of the outside layers, let's say this one, and then open it up to form a cone. Now, the way that you insert this into the Chemex, the direction you insert it, is actually very important. So what we've got now is we've got 3 sides of thickness here, and then a much thinner side here with just 1 ply. And we want to put the thicker side with a 3 ply at the same side as the spout of the Chemex, in like this. Why do we want to do that as opposed to putting it in any which way, or maybe even putting the thin end next to the spout? Well, that's because the spout does more than just pour the coffee when you're finished. It actually allows oxygen in as well. So as we're starting to pour this coffee, we have the potential here of kind of creating a bit of a vacuum. So if this spout gets completely blocked off, then no air is going to be able to escape from here as we're putting in liquid, and we will create a bit of a vacuum, and the extraction will slow down. The amount of time it will take the water to go through this filter will get slower and slower and eventually even stop. So we need to make sure that this spout always has airflow. So the way we do that is we put this thicker end alongside the spout, and that is less likely to get caught up in the spout when it gets wet, and will maintain good airflow. All right, let's get some actual coffee involved. So I've got some coffee grinds here. We want to look at something like a medium coarse grind is ideal for Chemex. It kind of resembles coarse sand. For me, that's just the medium grind size on my grinder. Now, really the best way to tell if you've got the grind size right is where you can see how long the extraction takes, but also just on the taste of the coffee. So you'd want to go finer for more extraction if the coffee's too weak or sour, and you'd want to go coarser to reduce bitterness or over extraction. Now let's talk coffee ratios. For this and most pour over systems, you want to go with a ratio of something like 1 gram of coffee to between 15 and 17 grams of water. I'm making a single dose here, and I'm going to be using 250 grams of water and 15 grams of coffee, which is on the higher end of that range. Also, for the heat of the water, somewhere between 195 to 205 Fahrenheit or 90 to 96 Celsius. I normally go at around 197 Fahrenheit or 92 Celsius. Generally though, it's going to depend on the roast of your beans. Lighter roasts go a bit lower to avoid over extracting bitter compounds. Darker roasts are generally a bit on the higher end. So let's actually brew a coffee with this thing. And here's what you need in addition to the Chemex and the filter itself. Basically, two things. One is a kettle, obviously. I'm using this kettle. It is a gooseneck kettle, which will make pouring much easier. I do recommend getting a gooseneck kettle if you can. I particularly like this one because it lets me set a very specific temperature. So I've set this to the temperature that I want, and it's going to keep cycling on and off to make sure that it maintains that temperature. The other thing you need is just a very simple set of scales. You can buy some really fancy coffee scales, but I'm just using some kitchen scales. And this will allow me to see how much water I'm adding as we go. So the whole time that I'm brewing, my Chemex will sit on top of the scale. Now we want to pre-wet the filter. So we just grab our hot water and just pre-wet it. Now there's three reasons for doing that. One is that when you're using paper, you can get a little bit of a papery taste. So just by rinsing out the filter, it will remove that. Secondly, it now conforms much better to the Chemex. It's opened it up, which will make it easier to use. And you can see now that the fact that this is the 3-ply this side can make a difference. If we take the saturated side here, it can see that it really starts to clog up this airflow. And then the third reason for adding this hot water in is it will actually heat up the Chemex itself. I like to give it a little bit of a swirl just to get the glass warm. That's good to go. So all we do now is we remove this filter out and then we dump out the water. So the Chemex is now set up. We're ready to add the coffee grounds. I like to give this a shake just so we have an even amount of coffee grinds there. Now the brewing process is going to be done in stages, and the first stage is called the bloom. So the idea of the bloom is that we are going to off-gas some of the CO2 that is trapped in the coffee and just let that bloom out so that we're not capturing it here. And to do that, we're going to add a portion of water, typically around 15% of your brewing water. The way I like to do this is just take the amount of coffee that I use, which in this case was 15 grams, and kind of double it. And that gets me close enough to the amount of water that I should add. So I'm going to look to add something like 30 to 35 grams of water as part of the bloom. So you can see now that there are CO2 bubbles that are forming here, and that is off-gassing that CO2. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the next stage of coffee and just kind of pouring in a circular motion and making sure the grounds are nice and wet. What we want to avoid doing is pouring water right on the edges, because what's going to happen if we do that is some of that water will actually not pass through the coffee grounds. It will just kind of work its way through the outside of the filter, bypassing the coffee entirely, and we're just adding hot water basically into our Chemex. So we want to make sure that we're always pouring in a circular motion and really focusing in on the center. Now, there's lots of different patterns you can do here in terms of how much water to add and how many stages to add. I will typically add something like 150 milliliters on the first pour. We don't want to add too much. If we're adding too much, then that water is sitting there just pooling up and it's being exposed to the air and it's getting cooler. But we also don't want to add too little where we're keeping the grounds super dry. So what we really want to make sure of is that the grounds are always hydrated, but there's not a huge pool of water sat on top of them. And we're just going to keep doing this until we reach our full volume of water, probably across 2 or 3 stages, until we get to, in this case, 250 milliliters. And that's about done. And a good brew time is somewhere between 3 to 4 minutes. Now, serving time. Few things to mention about this. Did I mention this is glass? It gets hot. This is hot. This is why you have this wooden collar here. This is how you hold it and pour out of it. And of course that means that it's taking heat away from the coffee. So it's not going to stay very warm in the Chemex. This is not something that you would put the coffee in and then kind of leave out for 30 minutes or an hour like you might do a thermos flask. So you need to get it out of this vessel, or you need to find a way to maintain heat to it afterwards. I'm going to pour it out and just drink it right away. And I have these Chemex shaped cups, which are quite fun. And there you have your coffee. In terms of cleaning this thing up, I typically just add some hot water into this from my kettle that was kind of left over. I will then give that a swirl and Dump that out. And how did this guy turn out? Yep, it is the smoothest tasting pour over coffee I think you can make because of that thick filter and this hourglass shape and all how it works. I'm a huge fan of the Chemex. Now, if you have your own processes for using the Chemex, maybe you have some tricks, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.